Hello. Listen carefully to this story. João was always seen as the perfect picture of success. As the owner of a big tech company, he spent most of his days locked in his office, watching numbers, leading meetings, and closing million-dollar deals. Time was his biggest enemy. He arrived at the office at 7 in the morning and didn't leave until around 10 at night. Time, which for most people was a gift, always seemed to be running out for João. The constant pressure to keep his business on top pushed him away from everyone and everything, including his own family. At home, he was a stranger, a guest who appeared late at night, too tired for any real connection. João had a wife and 2 kids. He gave them everything money could buy: the big house, expensive toys, designer clothes. But the most important thing was missing. He was never there when it truly mattered. He didn't go to his kids' school events, barely remembered their birthdays, and showed up at family gatherings only because he had to. When João finally had some time to be with his family, it always ended in a fight. His wife complained about his absence. His kids saw him as a stranger, and he felt misunderstood. To João, work was a necessary sacrifice to make sure his family was financially secure. What he didn't realize was that he was slowly losing what mattered most. Everything fell apart when the stock market crashed, taking his company down with it. Within weeks, João lost everything. What used to be a life of luxury and comfort turned into a spiral of chaos and desperation. Bills piled up. The house he had worked so hard to buy was about to be lost, and his family, already in trouble, now faced a burden of financial ruin. João felt lost, like the ground had disappeared from under his feet. Depression hit him like a heavy shadow, making his days dark and his nights sleepless. He didn't know what to do anymore. All the effort, all the sacrifice, and now he had nothing. João tried to hold on as long as he could. He tried to keep up appearances, looking for new business opportunities, but nothing seemed to work out. Without a job, without any prospects, and feeling the weight of defeat, he accepted what seemed like his only option: driving for a rideshare company. At first, it was humiliating for someone who had once been a corporate leader to drive around the streets, picking up passengers. He kept it a secret, not telling anyone what he was doing, and inside, with each ride, he felt like he was sinking deeper and deeper. Still, it was his only source of income at the time. His wife, once distant, now felt like a stranger. The arguments that had been so common turned into a heavy silence. His kids, whom he never truly got to know, barely looked him in the eye. João was completely isolated. With the weight of failure and the guilt of neglecting his family, he began to think about giving up entirely. He thought about ending it all because nothing made sense anymore. Everything he had built had crumbled. Sadness, shame, and humiliation were the only things he had left. João was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. It wasn't just the bankruptcy weighing on him, but the emptiness he felt, something no amount of money or success could fill. When the retired teacher got into the car, João didn't expect anything more than the usual comfortable silence. However, the teacher, with an almost otherworldly calm, looked at João with eyes that seemed to have witnessed the world turn many times. Sometimes, losing is the way to discover what really matters, he said, as if reading João's soul. João, with a forced laugh, just shook his head, thinking it was one of those cliches that didn't apply to his life. As he drove, João couldn't stop thinking about what the teacher had said. How could someone who had lost everything connect with those words? After all, João always believed that life was about accumulating and achieving. But at this point, with no job, no money, and worse, no direction, he wondered if he had really achieved anything at all. Life always gives us a second chance, the teacher continued, his voice echoing in the quiet of the car. João remained skeptical, but those simple words began to settle into his mind. Maybe there was something behind it all that he hadn't yet understood, but he wasn't ready to admit it. When they reached the destination, the teacher got out, leaving João with that same calm look and one final piece of advice. The second chance you're waiting for might not come in the way you expect, João. Pay attention. That stirred something inside him in an inexplicable way. For the first time in weeks, John felt something different, a spark, maybe a small glimmer of hope. Something about the teacher, the serenity he radiated, seemed to have planted a seed in John. Without realizing it, he found himself reflecting on the losses he had faced in a way he hadn't allowed before. And even though he didn't want to, he made a little room in his mind for the idea that maybe, just maybe, what he truly needed wasn't what he had always been chasing. John didn't have high expectations for his rideshare trips. For him, it was just a way to get by while his mind worked on some miraculous plan to rebuild his life. It was during one of these trips, on an ordinary day, that he picked up Lucas, a young cook who, with a simple demeanor, didn't seem to have much to offer besides small talk. However, in the middle of casual conversation, Lucas said something that resonated deeply with John. "I don't have much, but what I do have, I'm grateful for." That phrase, coming from someone who clearly had less than John ever had, felt like a slap in the face. John had always linked happiness to having more, to being in control of the future. But there was Lucas with a simple life, showing a genuine happiness that John couldn't understand. Throughout the ride, they talked about work, challenges, and dreams, but the gratitude Lucas expressed, even for the smallest things, made John think, how could someone who worked long hours every day in a small restaurant without much financial expectation be so content? "Every dish I make, I put a part of myself into," Lucas said. "And even if it's not the most expensive dish, I know I did something good." John, who was used to chasing big results, had never considered the value of small achievements. As Lucas got out of the car, John was left with that phrase echoing in his mind. "I'm grateful." Something so simple, yet it felt so distant from his own reality. He, who wanted everything, had never stopped to be grateful. And now that he had nothing, John started to question if he had ever truly appreciated what he had. A conversation with Lucas, which seemed so casual, had planted a new doubt in John's mind. And as he drove on to the next ride, he realized that the emptiness he felt wasn't just about material losses, but something much bigger that he still couldn't name. One afternoon, after yet another argument at home, John decided to take one more ride to clear his mind. He drove aimlessly, lost in his dark thoughts, when he decided that this would be his last ride. As he climbed a hill with a heavy heart and his mind filled with negative thoughts, an elderly woman waved him down by the side of the road. Without thinking much, he stopped the car. "This is my last ride," he muttered to himself. An older woman with a calm expression and a dignified posture got into the car and greeted John with a gentle smile. The silence in the car was broken by the soft voice of the woman, who began to talk about life, difficulties, and how sometimes we need to go through great storms to find the true path. John, still trapped in his own darkness, didn't want to listen, but something about this woman made him pay attention. She spoke with a serenity he hadn't experienced in a long time. Slowly, her words started to penetrate his heart in an unexpected way. She talked about her work as a missionary and how she had dedicated her life to helping others, always guided by something greater, an invisible force she didn't name right away. As he drove, John started to feel strangely unsettled. The woman's words weren't just ordinary advice. They carried a different weight. It was as if, without realizing it, she was touching the deepest wounds of his soul. She didn't speak directly of faith or religion, but something between the lines of her conversation began to stir something in John. He, who had always believed that everything was under his control, who never made room for anything beyond the tangible, now found himself confronted by something he couldn't explain. When they arrived at her destination, she looked at him with a deep gaze and said, "Have you ever thought that what you lost was only keeping you from finding what truly matters?" John, who had been determined to give up, felt something inside him begin to change. For the first time in months, he didn't feel the weight of depression, but a lightness he couldn't understand. The missionary's words had pierced deep into his heart, and he knew that, from that moment on, something in his life would begin to change. John spent weeks battling his own thoughts. The words of Mrs. Matilda, the advice from the teacher, and even the conversation with Lucas played over and over in his mind, day after day. He felt lost, like something was out of place in his life. It was strange because before, John believed that his losses were only material. But now he realized that the emptiness was much deeper. What he had truly lost was his connection to something greater, something he had always ignored, his resistance to faith, which once seemed like his greatest strength, now appeared to be a barrier keeping him from true peace. One afternoon, during a ride, John simply couldn't take it anymore. He pulled the car over to the side of the road, feeling a mix of desperation and deep exhaustion. For the first time in his life, he allowed himself to break down in the face of his own feelings. With trembling hands, he remembered Mrs. Matilda's words, "God is closer to you now." Those words touched him in a way he could no longer ignore. John, who had never thought of praying, did something completely new. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and with a shaky voice whispered, "If you really exist, show me the way. I don't know what to do." In that moment, John felt something he hadn't expected. It wasn't a magical solution or an immediate answer, but a sense of release, as if an invisible weight had been lifted off his shoulders. For the first time, he didn't feel alone. Prayer, something he once judged as a weakness, now seemed like an act of courage. John realized that by surrendering, he wasn't giving up, but finally making room for a new possibility, a new way of living. And although he didn't have all the answers, in that moment, he knew he wasn't fighting alone anymore. After that moment of surrender, John began to see life with a clarity he had never had before. He realized that his relentless pursuit of success and material wealth had clouded what truly mattered. The feeling of lightness that followed his prayer didn't fade. On the contrary, it seemed to grow each day. Determined to find a new purpose, John sought out Mrs. Matilda to talk again. As if she already knew what he was going to say, she greeted him with a serene smile and words that seemed to echo directly in his soul. "Your mission isn't to rebuild what you lost, John. It's to build something new." Those words immediately made sense. John hadn't just lost his company or his material possessions. He had lost the purpose of his life. Mrs. Matilda guided him to start again, not down the paths he knew, but on a new one. "You've been called to help those who need it most, John, the homeless, orphans, and the elderly. Your true wealth will be measured by the impact you make on their lives." That struck John as a truth he had never considered. The emptiness he had felt began to be filled, not with material things, but with a mission that, somehow, seemed to have always been there, waiting to be discovered. John then dedicated himself to helping those in need. He started small, visiting shelters and talking to people who, like him, had lost so much. But over time, he found that he was gaining something no money could ever buy, a sense of fulfillment and purpose. By offering words of hope, he found his own redemption. By helping others, he discovered that, in losing everything, he had gained the world. Not the material world, but a world of purpose, faith, and love. John finally understood that his true mission wasn't to rebuild his old life, but to build something much greater, something with eternal meaning. Now, stop and reflect. Are you truly living the purpose meant for you, or are you just chasing empty achievements? John discovered that true wealth isn't what we accumulate, but what we give to others. And you, what are you willing to lose in order to find your true path? Perhaps what feels like defeat today is actually the perfect opportunity for transformation. Life is offering you a second chance, just like it offered to John. Will you take it, or will you remain trapped in the fear of losing? If you want to keep learning how to turn challenges into opportunities, subscribe to the channel right now and turn on notifications. Together, let's discover how losses can become the greatest gains in your life.